So, you could see there was a massive difference. And when you do divestment like that, it's not an easy process. It's not just a matter of saying, we're just going to cancel all the fossil fuels from our portfolio, we're just going to remove them. It doesn't work like that. There's an awful lot of painstaking legal work that has to be done in terms of changing the mandate, the investment mandate that a fund has, that governs what kind of shareholdings it can take on and so on. And that requires, you have to go through a lot of legal processes to do that. It requires your shareholders to say that you can. It requires the drawing up of new mandates and so on. It requires their approval. So it's quite a kind of complex process. It's not something that you can do overnight. But changing those mandates, once a few of these funds had managed to change their mandates, there became templates available for how other funds could do the same. And so now it's much easier for someone. You don't have to start from scratch anymore to do divestment. There are templates there, there are examples that you can use. So that's really important, and that was part of this whole kind of build-up of that movement. What we've also had running alongside that is far greater requirements for transparency from companies. As we've heard, Mark Carney has taken the lead on that. There's also been a long-running project called the Carbon Disclosure Project, which has been running for about 15 years. And it's a completely voluntary thing, but it's asked companies to just tell us about their emissions, to publicise this. And at first, they got hardly any responses. Now, a majority of companies, whether they're in fossil fuels or not, now publish their emissions and the risks that they face from climate change. So again, that's another way in which shareholder activism has had a beneficial effect, and not just on fossil fuels. So you can see that there are wider ripple effects to divestment. But there are limitations to divestment as well, because no matter how much we all divest, that won't solve the problem of fossil fuels. And there's a very important reason for that. We were hearing earlier that I think it was there's 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of emissions since 1988. An awful lot of those companies are not susceptible to shareholder action. Why? Because they don't have any shareholders. Because actually the majority of the reserves of fossil fuels around the world today are not held by public companies. They're held by what's known as NOCs, national oil companies. National oil companies aren't necessarily in oil. The biggest are in oil, but a national oil company can also be a coal company or a gas company or any kind of fossil fuels, but they're all called national oil companies. National oil companies are the kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to divestment, because these are, as the name suggests, they're nationally owned. So a company like Aramco, it's Saudi Arabia's own oil company. It's the biggest oil company in the world. You might have heard about it because recently they started to take some steps towards an IPO, towards a flotation of shares. It's pathetic. They floated a tiny percentage of their shares. The vast majority of the shareholding is still owned by the Saudi state. And it's the same for states across the Middle East, and it's the same in places like India. It's the same across the world. The national oil companies still make up by far the biggest slice of fossil fuel extraction and production and reserves. And they don't have shareholders, and there's nothing that divestment will do to touch them. And the only way that you can bring any kind of pressure on them, to bear on them, is through the UN process and through other governmental processes and through public civil society processes. Those are the only ways that you can bring pressure to bear on them. Divestment won't work for them.
Thanks, Fiona. Riveting. Another excellent talk. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rowan Williams, who's currently the Master of Modelling, although he started off his academic career at Christ's. He's well known for being the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, amongst many things, and it's interesting to read here that you've been standing up for ethical issues for a long time, including being arrested once for campaigning for CND in the distant past. So we look forward to your thoughts on divestment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The perennial problem of being the last speaker in the group, of course, is that the others have said everything. But I will try and say what little is left as fully as I can. And I'll begin by saying how very much I agree with Tim that the issues around ethics and economics are not in fact two separate worlds of discourse. And one of the most poisonous things that we can believe is that somehow ethical considerations of economic in this context are always going to be intentional with one another. Tim spelled out, I think, very eloquently why that's not the case. But he's also foregrounded a question which I think we really need as a society to think about, not just in connection with climate issues, but much more broadly. And because he and I have worked a bit in the last few years around the theme of sustainable prosperity, without ever knowing that we're both alumni of the same college, this is an issue which has come back again and again. What do we mean by prosperity? What actually is wealth, when you ask the question? And what is growth? The only fully defensible account of prosperity, growth, wealth, and so forth is something to do with sustainable security and shared security. In other words, the idea that any one of us, any group of us, any nation in the world can indefinitely be secure while the rest is insecure, wealthy while the rest is poor, in a sense, won't work. And that is both an economic and an ethical perspective. For me, as a religious person, the ethical perspective comes in the vision that's set out in our scriptures. That is, that the optimal form of human community is one in which anybody's pain is everybody's issue, and anybody's wealth is everybody's opportunity. If you can hold those things together, I think you have some sense of how economics and ethics do indeed intersect. Just a couple more introductory comments. One is to echo a bit what Fiona's been saying about the ways in which opportunities for exercising pressure have increased, even though there are many areas where these particular tactics don't work. And simply to say there something about the experience of my current college, Magdalene, which is that the effect of changing our investment managers a couple of years ago to a firm with a far higher level of literacy about these issues than our previous investment managers has made a very substantial difference both to our portfolio and actually to our returns, in exactly the way Tim has said. So I would underline what's been said. The opportunities are greater. There are firms who specialize in this, firms who will offer you products to intensify and enhance your performance in that way. So that's just to echo a point there. The second thing is to say, for those of you who haven't heard, that the Church of England General Synod today voted through a motion to set a zero carbon target for 2030, having received a report which recommended 2045. Now, very occasionally the Church of England gets things right. Don't get me started. In this particular instance, it is very significant that pressure, in a way pressure which has been mounting at an unexpected rate, even in the last 2 years, has changed the landscape. And I think it is very important that we tell ourselves some good stories about how targets are revised, how a climate of opinion is changed. But essentially, I was asked to speak this evening about the very notion of climate justice. And so, leaving aside some of the specifics we've been looking at and one or two of the points I've touched on already, I want to broaden out the discussion into that sphere and ask about how we define climate justice, what it amounts to, what the priorities it suggests are. Climate justice, as it happens, is the primary campaigning focus of the charity which I currently chair, which is Christian Aid. And Christian Aid, historically the relief and development arm of the British and Irish churches, has picked up climate justice as an issue primarily because in all our development work across the less prosperous parts of the world, the effects of climate change have been inextricably woven in with development issues. You cannot begin to think about economic development without addressing the impact of climate change. Whether that is, let's say, desertification in parts of Kenya and its impact on agriculture, or rising water levels in Bangladesh or the Pacific Islands. We have a considerable amount of work in Bangladesh and are also regularly in touch with the Pacific Islands. And that pinpoints the first element in thinking about climate justice. The first, and in some ways the simplest. Who is it that is currently paying for our lifestyle? And who is going to be paying for it in 15 or 20 years' time? And the answer is crystal clear. It is those who are already in economically disadvantaged positions. Those in economically disadvantaged positions in our own society, those in economically disadvantaged contexts across the world. And if we are concerned about, again, just and sustainable economies, security that is shared and allows some sort of stability, some sort of trustworthiness in a social and economic environment, this is a primary question. Climate justice begins with a recognition of who's paying. On any analysis, the adverse effects of climate change weigh most heavily on the most vulnerable. They weigh heavily on unprotected workers of various kinds, and therefore disproportionately heavily on women. They weigh heavily on economies that are dependent on what you might call forced external investment, that is, economies in small and poor countries like Papua New Guinea, where spectacularly corrupt governments mortgage the entire economy and the society to the extractive industries. They weigh heavily, quite simply, on countries where the sheer physical effect, year on year, of climate change, as I say, desertification in Kenya, where those effects are shrinking the possibilities of productive agriculture and the like. So that's point one about climate justice. Point two is the one which I suppose is both most emotionally powerful for many people and most difficult to get a clear handle on sometimes. And that is justice towards the next generation. Most people feel instinctively that our children and grandchildren have some right to a sustainable and manageable global environment. But you'll still find plenty of people who will say, well, that is a very abstract right, and the kind of duty we have to those we will never see in the future is a duty which is perhaps not quite so obvious as the duty we owe to ourselves and our contemporaries. But I think it's important to defend our instincts on that. When we seek to create what I've called a shared security, we recognise that our proper instinct to nurture the next generation is one that requires us to imagine futures where we don't have complete control, but futures which are shaped significantly by the decisions we make now, and whose impact on that generation we're seeking to nurture is significant. If we do have a natural nurturing capacity for the next generation, if, in plain English, we want to see the human race continue, which on the whole we do, then, go figure, as our American cousins like to say, It's not a matter of having an abstract duty to non-existent people 100 years from now. It's a matter of a very specific kind of duty now to maintain an environment where security is possible, so that another generation may be nurtured, may be raised, nourished, and sustained. So to be just to the next generation, that is, to offer them what we believe is due to them, is not, after all, so fictional, so remote, so abstract. So, justice towards those who are currently paying and will pay more for our own lifestyle. Justice in respect of a world in which human nurture can continue in ways that we value. And thirdly, what I would call justice in the sense of attunement to the reality we live in. And this is the most, I suppose, nakedly moral claim that we could have. Just behaviour is appropriate behaviour. It's finding out how to respond aptly or appropriately to the world we are in fact inhabiting. What kind of recommendation of behaviour is it which says fundamentally it doesn't matter what the processes of the world are? I will select the effects I like and work with those. Is that a model that we want for human life? A model in which we systematically block out the effects of our acts? Or is it more just, in the widest possible sense of that word, to seek a kind of life whose relation with the material environment we're part of is appropriate, that is, attentive to, respectful of the way things are. Not passive, not detached. We don't simply have to step back, screw our eyes up and fold our arms, but how our action, the question is how our action in respect of the environment we're part of fits with, goes with the grain of what we're part of. And for several centuries, Western culture has closed its eyes to that. And we've created arguably the most unnatural culture that the globe has ever seen. Unnatural in the sense of recklessly inattentive to the way things actually work, and therefore a fundamentally dishonest culture. Dishonesty is not caring what the facts are. The sort of thing that one or two people in public life seem very good at. But is that where we want to be in our own humanity? Because there is an injustice in that, an unfitness, a lack of correspondence and harmony with the way things are. So in addition to thinking about who pays, in addition to thinking about the nurture of the next generation, I suggest we think about what a just life is in relation to the kind of world this is, an honest life, as you might say. How do we spring ourselves from the trap of global dishonesty? Large question. But I end with that question partly because I think it's quite important in terms of motivation. What I mean is this. We've been reminded by both previous speakers this evening that our chances of actually getting this right are quite slender. This may not work. Face it, this may not work. So do we simply put, as it were, a corporate paper bag over our heads and wait for the end? Or do we say there is something profoundly worthwhile about discovering another kind of human relation to our environment, which is in itself more just, more life-giving, more fundamentally in accord with how things are, more honest? Is that worth doing? Because actually, if we can have that at the centre of our motivation, we may find more freedom, more energy, and even more flexibility in the campaigning we do about these very specific goals and targets that we've been discussing this evening. And that's why, without wanting to sound a note either of undue pessimism or a note of undue optimism about what might be possible in our campaigning, we need maybe a note simply of realism. This is the real world. If we want to live in the real world with a degree of honesty, open-mindedness, clarity, this is how to do it. Get that straight and maybe other things follow.
Thank you. That was phenomenally inspiring. I'm sure you all feel the same. I feel like it's tricky for me to ask some questions that are concrete now and bring us back down to some detail. I think it's worth saying that, I mean, I work at a climate change institute. We talk a lot about this issue. I think that's the best series of 3 speakers I've ever seen. So it's going to be tricky to follow. I'd like to start with a challenging question. I'll ask a couple of questions and then I'm sure you're all aching to ask questions. There are obviously challenges ahead. All of you alluded to challenge in different kinds of ways. I'm going to ask quite a direct question about vested interest. Obviously, Fiona, you mentioned national oil companies. We know that's a challenge. We've talked about the challenge of the rate of change, and you spoke very eloquently about the way in which we actually may need to fundamentally change our relationship with humanity. And whilst many, hopefully now all people in the room recognize this, there are many people who might not recognize that. And worse than that, they might be actively working against these goals. I'd like to hear a bit from each of you about those vested interests, who they are, and how you think we should be dealing with those. Maybe I'll start with, well, does one of you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think, in a way, but if you ask the question, why are governments still subsidising fossil fuels, it does come back directly to vested interest with undue power over political process. And so in a sense, that sense of vested interest that has begun to, and maybe for many years has kind of undermined the power of governments actually to operate in the public interest. And it's something, it's something that belongs in a way to the kind of unreal sense of the economy that Rowan was talking about, the kind of economy that's sort of detached itself from reality and has flown into a sort of stratosphere where there is an ethic which says that the market knows best and the government should stay out of the way. And quite often people will appeal to Adam Smith in that context and say, it's the invisible hand of the market that makes things work properly. We should let the market do its work and we should not think about the power of government. That is such a misreading of Adam Smith that it's almost unbelievable. Adam Smith knew above anyone the power of vested interests to corrupt the public interest, and he saw very specifically that the only response to big company interest is a powerful, effective government working in the public interest. Now it's very clear from the cases that Fiona was talking about, to even sadly to our own government at this point in time, that understanding of the need for government and the need for a social contract, the need for a government that's working in the interest not just of this generation but of future generations, actually is an absolute necessity for any kind of long-term prosperity. And so in one way I want to say that is a kind of side issue from the issue of what we as individuals, as colleges, as investors, as savers can do with our money. And that powerful message actually that there is choice that you can make at this point in time, in spite of those vested interests. And if you take Rowan's point that you want to live in the world in the right way, then it's obvious that you make those choices, even if actually vested interests are in the process of undermining government in ways that prevent that transition taking place at the speed we would like it to right now. And I think the only thing that I would kind of add to that, we can do that. We can do that as individuals, as investors, as savers, as people engaged in the market, as people with pensions, in our consumption choices, in our behaviours. We have that choice to do the right thing, even if there are a lot of people in the world who don't do the right thing and who are undermining the power of the government to encourage us to do the right thing. But the second thing it seems to me that we have to do in those circumstances is really about political activism. It's about having a government that can hold those vested interests to account and that can do it in a way that looks after the interests of future generations. And just by a quirk of circumstance, actually, I was invited somewhere else this evening, which I realised after I remembered Eva's invitation to come here that I couldn't do, which is a celebration in the House of Lords at the moment from John Bird, who was the founder of the Big Issue, for his Future Generations Bill, Tomorrow for Today, I think it's called, or something like that. So that the activism that's needed aside from our individual choices in life is an activism that persuades our governance, our governments, and our political system that the future matters, and that is the response to vested interests which seek to undermine that contract.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I'd echo everything that's been said and just add a couple of very brief comments on that. One is, I think, that the question reinforces the recognition that what we're facing at the moment globally is, of course, a crisis of democracy. There was a book a few years ago on the American Constitution called The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. But it's not just the American Constitution that's a problem here. We are globally in a situation where democratic government is, if you like, squeezed between naked populism on one side and naked heavy financial interest on the other. And that leaves very little room for active and critical civil society, which is where activism of the kind we've been discussing comes in. It's not simply about solving a problem connected with climate change, it's about recreating an active, argumentative democracy, one in which there really is exchange, tension, discernment, decision, and responsibility. So that's the context in which I think this has to be framed. And that's why the resurgence, especially in the last 18 months or so, of often quite radical activism around the climate issue is, to me, quite a good augury for the future of democracy. I'd be very worried if some people were not aiming to walk off King's Parade in a few days' time.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I think that we never want peace to break out on a panel. I think there is a kind of common thread between what we've been saying and it is that really anyway I think these vested interests have become so pervasive that we won't even recognise them as such anymore. And that, Tim was saying about this kind of misinterpretation of Adam Smith, it seems that while the market is a good tool, when used properly, can be a good tool for humanity, instead we've let it become more than that. There's no proverb about fire being a good servant but a bad master. Well, the market has become for us the master instead of our servant. We are all the servants of the market, and that's not the way it should be. And one of the reasons I brought up that landmark case, that 1919 case, the Darwin and Ford Motor Company, is that it marked that kind of switch between seeing the market as a servant and us all becoming the servants of the market, as we all have now become. So, we have governments that were kind of predicated on this idea of free markets to the extent that they will not take on the vested interests in fossil fuels and other parts of the economy that are actually killing us. And it's an absurd situation, and almost it takes, it really takes a sort of a youthful generation of activists, I think, to make us see that. I was in Madrid at the climate talks in December, And we went on a march, there was 500,000 people in this march through Madrid, led by Greta Thunberg and by a small group of teenagers, and then in this mass of people following on. And almost it's taken people like Greta Thunberg and young activists like that who've come to this with fresh eyes and said, who've seen it for what it is, who've seen through the vested interests, who've seen through this kind of flummery about the market that we've all accepted and internalised, and have exposed it as the falsehood that it is.
And that's something to do also with the way in which civil society at every level is meant to give permission to governments to respond to the reality, not the pressure. And that sense that a good democracy is one where people give permission to politicians to do what's right and reasonable. We get the politicians and the governments we deserve to say, so if we don't hold people to account.
Good, so also some good practical tips for people in the room there and how to respond to these vested interests, and in a way thank you for helping to refresh the way that we think about vested interests. I'm just going to ask one more question to the panel and then open it out to you. You all explored to some extent some philosophical concepts in what you were discussing, and since we are talking about divestment and we are in college, I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit about purpose and leadership and responsibility as it may apply to a Cambridge college, for example.
I think in a lot of the discussion in the university about, and the colleges, about divestment, the notion that a university is called on to exercise some public responsibility and some moral leadership has been very much to the fore. And in a way, my sense is both university and colleges, mine included, can be a bit startled to be told that that is part of what an institution of higher education is there for. Because we're in a period of some barbarism about higher education, where it's functionalised, trivialised and narrowed down. And the notion that these institutions exist partly to create critical societies, to create people who ask difficult questions, to create momentum. Well, I totally foregrounded that again, I think. And it's a good opportunity, not only, again, all these things join up, not only to address a particular crisis around climate change, but to remind ourselves as institutions, as educational institutions, that we are not just servicing an inexorable machine of national economy. We are growing into a kind of critical maturity where we ask, we discern, we shape and reshape.
Yeah, it's nice. Fiona, you.
Yeah, well, of course, when I was here, I studied English, which, as you know from Dominic Cummings, qualifies you to do nothing. So I'm sorry that the last 30 years have been a complete waste of my time. But I didn't find it so. We had, I think the whole point of university and the idea of university, in fact, there was a book, The Idea of University, wasn't it, by Cardinal Newman.
Yes, they're getting started.
Just been canonised, and he would be appalled, I think, at the idea that a university is not a moral place. The university is a place for moral leadership. And that awful phrase that we use today, thought leadership. But if we can't take action on issues like this, and if we can't develop a new way of looking at the world, and what we urgently need is a new way of looking at the world, because the way that we have of looking at the world at the moment is broken, and the way that we see the world functioning for us, the way in which we perceive the value of nature in economic terms, that's a broken way of looking at the world, and it's only at universities that we'll be able to fix it, because outside of universities people are so involved in the mechanics of the market that they can't even see that that's what they're living in. It's like fish in water, they can't even see the element that they're living in, and it's only at universities that we can actually take that view and see the water
Brilliant. And Tim?
Yeah, 52 years ago at the University of Kansas in America, Robert Kennedy gave a really famous speech. It became famous because it was a speech in which he critiqued the GDP, the measure of economic growth, and it was a quite extraordinary thing to do at the time for a mainstream politician. It happened to be the first day of his campaign to be US president, a campaign that, as we know now, was fatally ended by the gunman that assassinated him. But in that first speech, he started the speech. It's a speech that's fascinated me for a long time, partly because it kicked off a lot of my work, but it started that speech by saying, and this was a particular point in time, 1968, so the Vietnam War was still going on, there was massive ethnic inequality, huge poverty even across America, the richest nation in the world. And he started that speech by saying, the more riots there are across the campuses of US universities, the better the world for tomorrow. And so it's I'm not suggesting because the master is here. But I was trying to think, I mean, in a way, in a small kind of way, that's exactly what you guys are doing. You are saying, this is not right. We are being educated in a college that's putting its wealth into things that are against our own interests in the future, against the interests of other people. We are prepared to speak up. I think in my day, I mean, Fiona talked about recycling. My little campaign was actually, I signed a petition to allow Christ's College to allow women to enter the college for the first time. And I can't say, in all honesty, that was a very altruistic thing that I was doing. I've been to a single-sex school for 7 years. I never did really benefit from it because there was one student, a woman student, the first ever woman student was admitted in my last year in college, but I now know why I did it. It was so that I could sit on a panel with Alyssa and Fiona. The point of leadership in those circumstances is not to tell everybody what to do. It is obviously sometimes to make difficult decisions, but in the process of making those decisions, it is to listen. And that's, I think, exactly what is so good about this process here today.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you for all those answers to my questions. And we've got some time for any of you who have questions to ask them. So, traditional way, hands up. More people must have questions than just one person. Okay, I'm going to give the master the first question.
Because you're looking for a question.
Oh, yeah, well, there are a few. There are a few.
Okay, that's fine.
Oh, now everyone's hands disappeared. Come on, do it again. Okay, you were first, go ahead.
Thank you so much for what is a really interesting talk. And I think I'd like to start my question by just saying I think I agree with 100% of what was said today. About Tim's talking about the need of an active government and cutting subsidies for oil companies. Fiona's criticism of the fiduciary duty to shareholders that is stopping firms from considering all the people that are being affected outside of business decisions, and also Rowan's talk about climate justice. I think for me, the moral issue is really clear, and I think most economists like Nordhaus would 100% agree with everything that's been said there. That being said, I think I might be the only person in the room who is still sceptical about divestment, and I think that really comes down to me of a question not about what is the right thing to do, but is divestment the right way to do it? And it really comes down about really asking what divestment as a process is. And if I could just take the time to kind of outline my problems, because it's something that I really have been looking to be persuaded about for the past 3 years. I've really failed people to find a convincing case that I can really buy into. So it really begins about asking what divestment as a process is. Because when the university is to sell its shares, by definition, it's selling those shares to somebody else. So it's really not getting rid of the problem, it's just moving it from a visible way to somewhere invisible. And I feel that is really problematic in kind of 2 ways. One, it reallocates profits to people who are much likely to use it in a much more corrupt or harmful way, because it's from a university that could be pressured by students to be taking this money and investing it in more beneficial ways, but instead to people who don't care about it. And it's also losing a really important voting mechanism. And when you have shares, you can actually influence the decisions that companies are making. And we could hope that instead of selling shares, would take an active role as a shareholder and vote for companies like Shell to actually start investing in solar energy and cutting their expansions. But again, by selling it to people who by definition don't care about the environment because they are buying these shares, we're really giving what is a lot of power away to other people. And the other thing that I would really like to emphasize is actually talking about the empirical evidence. because the fact is that there's been really no empirical evidence or studies asking actually a really fundamental question, which is, does divestment have an effect? And there have been no studies in terms of fossil fuels, but Alice mentioned before that this isn't the first time that divestment is an issue. There have been examples in South Africa in the 1980s and tobacco in the 1990s. And when you look at